counting. Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Stephanie Wood, and I'm really excited to be here today on explore.org to talk about gray seals. As you can see on the live camera, there's a whole bunch of weaned gray seal pups on Seal Island in the mid-coast Maine area. I'm going to start out just talking a little bit about the biology and history of gray seals, and then I am happy to field people's questions. So gray seals are found in the North Atlantic, so they're found in the Baltic Sea, around parts of the UK, and then also here on the east coast of North America. Here they're found from the Gulf of St. Lawrence all the way around south to Nantucket Sound. Gray seals are sexually dimorphic, which means the males and females look different. The males can get to be quite large, 8 to 9 feet long, and up to 800 pounds. The females are a little bit smaller. You won't see any adults on Seal Island anymore. They have all left for the season. But if you were able to check out the site earlier this month, you were able to see probably males interacting with males, moms taking care of their pups, males and females interacting. We're at the tail end of the pupping season at this point, which is why you only see pups on the island. So around this part of their range, gray seals are born between mid-December into the end of January. When the pups are born, we've had several questions about their size. They're roughly 30 pounds, and they spend about 2 to 3 weeks with their mom. And during that time, they gain a lot of weight, and then the moms abruptly wean them, and then the pups go through a predictable molt. So they're born kind of small and scrawny with white fur, and then they lose that during the course of the season, which is why you might see the variation in the pups that are still available. Excuse me. Excuse me, I have a little bit of a cold, so I will try to keep the coughing to a minimum. So we know from Native American shell middens and also colonial writings that gray seals were historically part of the Northwest Atlantic ecosystem. Their remains have been found at Native American sites all the way south and west into Long Island Sound. but they went locally extinct throughout much of New England in the early to mid 1900s, likely due to a series of bounty systems that lasted into the mid 1900s. They have made a recovery since that time, and we like to think about gray seals that we see in U.S. waters as part of the larger Northwest Atlantic population. So as I mentioned, gray seals are found in the Gulf of St. Lawrence and also off the coast of Nova Scotia. The largest pupping site is on Sable Island, and then we have several pupping sites down here. But we know from both genetic studies and also satellite tagging that these animals are moving throughout this range. So it's really important to think of the animals that we see here in the context of a larger Northwest population. I think I will shift over and try to start to answer some of the questions that have been coming in. And I have to start with Mrs. Kramer's second grade class from the Fairbanks Road Elementary School in Rochester, New York. And I love to hear that you are learning about seals. I actually remember learning about seals when I was in elementary school. That's how long I've been interested in them. So one of the questions from our second grade class is, how long do the seals live with their mom? So it's a fairly short time. The gray seal pups are with their moms from about between 16 to 21 days. And so they spend that time with their mom, nursing, drinking the mom's milk, which is very nutritious and high in fat and protein, and they gain a lot of weight. So they weigh well over 100 pounds, a healthy weaned gray seal, in that 2 to 3 week period. So it's a short time. They're on the land with their mom the whole time. The moms actually stay with the pups. They don't go out to eat. What the moms do is they use their blubber or their fat, and they use that fat and convert it into milk for the pup and also energy for the mom. So it's a pretty intense time period of mothering for the females, but it's fairly short. And so after that time period, the moms leave the pups. They end up mating before they leave the site, and then the pups hang out on the pupping site for another week or two, and they go through, as I mentioned, this predictable molt where they lose their white fur and they lose a little weight, and eventually they become hungry enough to head out into the water, and that's where they learn to both swim and eat on their own. And so it's very different from what we humans experience in terms of care, parental care. It's very intense and physically demanding for the mom, and then she is gone and the pups are on their own. And so that is what happens in terms of how long seal pups live with their mom. Let's take a look at some of the other questions that we do here. Excuse me. There was another question, is, are they really completely on their own, or will they gather as a group and learn from others? So the pups do gather in groups, as you can see on the live camera right now. You'll see pups sort of hanging out with each other in little groups, but they do learn to forage on their own. And so their moms do not teach them how to find the fish or how to swim. So another question is, how many pups are produced in each gestation? And so typically there's only one pup per gestation. Very, very rarely twins have been observed in pinnipeds. Pinnipeds are the group of animals that includes all the true seals, the sea lions, the fur seals, and the walruses. And really that twinning is very rare, and it's unlikely that both pups would survive. As I just mentioned, the moms really convert much of their blubber into milk to fatten those pups up so they have a good chance for surviving that first year or so of their life. And it really physiologically would be very hard for a mom to get two pups to a healthy weaning weight. There's another question that says, are the seals affected by the crazy winds? And that's a great question. So gray seals, from an evolutionary standpoint, are actually, are ice seals. And so that means their evolutionary history, and still to this day in parts of their range, they actually have their pups on ice. So if you go up into the Gulf of St. Lawrence or the Baltic Sea, the pups are actually born on ice. And so other ice seals include things like harp seals and hooded seals and a lot of the Antarctic seals. So they're actually well adapted for the crazy winds and the cold weather that we would not want to be out there having our 1 or 2 day old babies, but they are adapted to it, and so they're okay with the crazy winds. Let's see what else we have along the same lines. How do the pups learn to swim? We already talked about that. They actually teach themselves. There's a couple of questions about global warming and how that might impact seal colonies. So as we see, global warming impacts different parts of the globe in different ways. So right now, for people living in the Northeast, our last few winters have been fairly intense, which the gray seals are well adapted for. Over time, as we see temperatures changing, it's likely that gray seals will be limited in terms of their southern range. Again, because they are adapted to being out in the cold, they're adapted to living on ice. They have all that blubber that keeps them warm, and so physiologically there is a limit to how warm is safe for them to get. And so over time, we may end up seeing that the southern limit of their range will shift north. Right now in the Northwest Atlantic, where we are, the southern limit of pupping is Nantucket Sound. We see individuals that sometimes move further south, but that's the southern point where we see pups being born. And again, as I mentioned, the gray seals here in the US and Canada are born in December and January. When we look in other parts of their range, for example in the Baltic Sea, they're born in March, and there has been studies done there that have looked at weaning mass, that's how heavy the pups are when the moms leave, on years when there's a lot of ice and when there's not a lot of ice. And what's been found is that moms are able to transfer more mass or get their pups fatter when they're able to be on the ice in that part of their range. And so things like ice availability will definitely impact gray seals in these parts of their range. And so these are really great questions and thinking about trends we're seeing and how that might impact them. Interestingly enough, in the UK and parts of Scotland and Ireland, gray seals actually have their pups in the fall, in September to November. And in those parts of their range, what is often seen is that the animals are around pools, naturally occurring pools on those haul-out sites, and the thought is that they're actually using those pools to cool themselves off. So temperature, it can definitely be a limiting factor for these populations. What else do we have? Let's see, how long do gray seals live for? So gray seals have fairly low survival rates when they're young. So first year mortality, so from the time the pup's born, is weaned and heads out to sea to fend for itself till it turns 1. First year mortality is somewhere between 40 to 60%. So it's tough to be a seal pup and make it on your own. But what we see in these populations is if you're a seal and you can make it to say age 3 or 4, then your survival rates jump up quite dramatically, and survival rates jump up into the 80 or 90 percentiles. And if you can make it there, we see seals that live to be well into their 30s and even 40. There's been a lot of research done on Sable Island off the coast of Nova Scotia, where they have individually marked animals and watched them year after year returning to Sable Island to have their pups. And so they have a great amount of information in terms of age. And so we do see animals that make it into their 30s. There was one year when I was out on Muskeget Island, which is a gray seal pupping site near Nantucket, and I was 30, and I saw a large male, and there was a brand on him, and I was able to send that up to researchers in Canada and found out that this male was 31, so that was pretty cool to see. So they can live a long time if they can get through those first few years. Let's see what else we have for evolutionary reasons for the spots. So that is probably just like we see in a lot of animals, camouflage. And the pups as well that are born with the white fur, that is, again, from an evolutionary standpoint, related to the fact that they're ice seals, and so that white fur would protect them or help them camouflage themselves on ice. Excuse me. going to go through some of our other questions here. So there are a couple of questions about what do seals typically eat, and that is a question people always have, and it's a great question because it's wide-ranging. So seals, pinnipeds in general, are generalist. So what does that mean? It means they eat the food that's around them, and so they are they're not picky, so they will eat a variety of fish. So they will eat flatfish, they'll eat squid, they'll eat cod, they'll eat all sorts of different fish depending on what is available. Sand lance, herring, redfish, whitefish, hake, all of those things we see when we look at the diet of seals. But the question has sort of multiple layers, right? And there's multiple ways to approach foraging behavior. So what do you eat is an important question, but there's other pieces. Where are you eating it and when are you eating it? So these animals are moving around off of the northeast US and Canada. And so it's not just what are you eating, but where and when, and how do we get to that information? So there's multiple ways to approach food habits or foraging questions. So the basic is we can go out to the beach and we can pick up seal poop, and we can rinse the seal poop off, and we can find otoliths, which are fish ear bones, and we can identify the fish that were in that scat or poop, and that can tell us, what those seals ate probably in the last 12 or 24 hours. Sometimes we have seals that don't make it and they're no longer alive, and we can look inside their stomachs and we can look at their stomach contents and reconstruct what they just ate. Again, those are very recent feeding events. So if you want to start to think about, well, what are seals eating in the winter versus the summer, or the spring versus the fall, or when they're off Nantucket versus when they're out offshore foraging, we can take approach using more chemical approaches, things like stable isotopes that we can obtain from either whiskers or bones or teeth, or something called fatty acid analysis, where we actually can look at the layers of fat and try to figure out what have they been eating over the past few months. And then the other piece of information is really important, is where are they moving? And so there are researchers that are deploying tags of various types to see where do these animals go. And so the feeding question is a really important one, and it needs to be put in the context of the layers of what we're trying to get at. Are we wondering what they're eating yesterday just off Seal Island in Maine, or are we wondering what this population is eating and what impact that's having on the ecosystem at large? So the food question is really interesting. There's another question along the lines of food. How long do pups nurse before they start to eat food? So again, they nurse for about 2 to 3 weeks, and then they go into a post-weaning fast, and so they don't eat for probably anywhere from 7 to 10 days, and they live off that fat that they've gained from their mom's milk. And eventually they get hungry enough and head out to sea and learn to eat on their own. There's another question about, are their numbers in decline? So that is a great question as well, and the answer is no. As I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, gray seals were really a rarity for most of the 1900s in New England, in both Maine and Massachusetts, and really throughout much of Canada. There were bounty systems. The way a bounty system worked was that people would be paid anywhere from $1 to $5 to go out and kill a seal. The seals were perceived as a threat to our fish, and so the idea was to reduce competition with seals for fish stocks. And so the way the bounties worked was the person would turn in either a nose or a tail, and they would be paid anywhere from $1 to $5. There were state bounties in both Massachusetts and Maine, off and on from the mid-1800s through the mid-1900s, and then many coastal communities also had local bounties. This is not uncommon. There are bounties throughout much of gray seal range, and there are bounties on other things like bobcats and wolves and all sorts of species that we perceived as a. The tricky thing is, so there are bounty records available, which we can use to show that gray seals were here, and people were hunting them or killing them for bounties, but the numbers are not reliable, because what used to happen was people would cheat. They'd take one seal pelt and they'd cut it up and fashion it to look like multiple tails to get more money. But we do know that they were hunted, and this pressure basically had meant the population was extirpated or went locally extinct from New England. In Massachusetts, the largest pupping site is Muskeget Island, just off Nantucket, and a woman named Valerie Rowe was able to document the return of gray seals to Nantucket Sound in the early 1990s. She was able to document the very first pups being born back in U.S. waters. And what's really great is that she was also able to identify individual moms because of the brands or the marks that they had received when they were born on Sable Island. And so she could send that information up to researchers on Sable. And so we know that Sable Island was a big part of the source population for gray seals to recover here in U.S. waters. Dr. Jim Gilbert was able to document the return of gray seal pupping in Maine as well, in the mid-coast Maine area. And what we've seen in the last basically 30 years is a consistent increase in the number of gray seal pups born both at sites in Maine and Massachusetts. Likewise, the same trend has been documented in Canada. And so the population as a whole has been increasing, and we've also seen increase at our local sites. Excuse me. And that has brought with it some various reactions from people living and working near these areas. For most people, seals were a rarity in our lifetime in many parts of this range. And so it's quite striking if you are someone who either lived on Cape Cod or on the islands around Cape Cod or in mid-coast Maine, and there were never seals, and now you can see sometimes thousands, tens of thousands of seals in those areas. It can be quite stark or quite dramatic. But I always like to remind people that this is actually a conservation success story, and so gray seals have been protected by the Marine Mammal Protection Act since 1972. And so they have been able to recover. And there's probably a few key factors as to why their populations have recovered. We know that the Sable Island population in Canada is a healthy population that grew exponentially for about 40 years. And so that was a great source population for individuals to move further south back into parts of their historic range and reestablish pupping. The other thing is that island use has changed over time off the coast of New England. So somewhere like Seal Island, where the camera is set up, we know that Seal Island historically was used as a fish camp. And what that means is basically before the time of having powerful engines and refrigeration on boats, people would go out fishing, and then before they could get it all the way back to the mainland, they would have to stop and dry the fish so it wouldn't spoil. So we know Seal Island was important. There was a human activity there for a long time. And then Seal Island was also used for target practice by the military for some time. And in, I believe, the mid-70s, it was transferred over to U.S. Fish and Wildlife. And so it's a much quieter place now. Likewise, on Muskeget in 1900, Muskeget is the island off Nantucket where they pup. There were something like 25 to 30 hunting cabins, and so people would be out there year round. And so what we've seen is, as humans, we've started to use islands less and less frequently, and that's actually opened up habitat to other animals to recover into parts of their former range, which is really kind of a neat story, because often what we hear in terms of conservation is that habitat is not available for a lot of species. And so that's a conservation success story. Let's see, a lot of discussion along sort of, this is another question that follows up to what I was just asking. And so there's a lot of question. Oftentimes we're asked, well, how many seals should there be? And how many seals is too many seals? And those are great questions. And they're not easy to answer. So we know that gray seals have always been part of the ecosystem, of the Northwest Atlantic ecosystem, but we don't have a good estimate on the numbers. Excuse me. In terms of carrying capacity isn't a set number. So carrying capacity is basically just the idea or theory that every ecosystem every population in an ecosystem is limited by resources, right? There can only be so many plants, animals, people, bacteria, whatever it is, in an ecosystem. And carrying capacity is based on the available resources. And so it's a bit hard to give a specific number in terms of carrying capacity because there's a lot of moving pieces. What prey is available to the seals here? How much hauling out space is there? Things like disease can also impact seal growth as well. We sometimes see outbreaks of certain diseases that will bring down populations for a bit. And so we don't have enough data to really pinpoint if they've reached their carrying capacity. Gray seal growth on Sable Island has slowed. They're still growing, but when we see a slowing in a growth rate, that often is indicative that the population is approaching carrying capacity. The other ways to think about carrying capacity is you can look at certain age classes, so things like how old are the moms when they first have their pups. So from a physiological standpoint, we know gray seal females become pregnant anywhere from the age of 3 to 6. And so that is somewhat dependent on their nutritional state, right? So if you have tons of food and you're really healthy and all your nutritional needs are being met, chances are you're going to be ready, your body's going to be ready to have a pup earlier. Maybe you're 3 or 4. If you're a little bit nutritionally strained or it's a little bit harder to find those resources, probably you're going to spend another year or two getting a little bit bigger before you actually undertake the task of having a pup and weaning that pup. Likewise, things like juvenile survival. So once these animals are 2 or 3 years old, what's their survival rates? And so carrying capacity requires a lot of different demographic information, which we don't have a lot of that here yet, but we're looking forward to continuing some of our work in tagging to figure some of that out. Really great questions. Let me see what else I may or may not have found yet. So which natural enemies do gray seals have and how do they protect themselves? So obviously humans, we have been an enemy, if that's the right word. I don't know if I'd use the word enemy, but a predator. And certainly for a long time humans have hunted seals as a subsistence hunt and used food and blubber and fur for survival. And then I mentioned also bounty systems, which also obviously impact gray seals. Probably people are familiar with white sharks, so they certainly are natural predators. We do see sometimes things like coyotes taking a young seal pup, and so there are some natural predators out there that can impact them as well. All right, what else do we have here in terms of our questions? There's another question, are gray seals aggressive in and out of the water? So that's another great question. And so what we see is the time where we might see aggressive behavior in gray seals really is in males that are breeding. And so there are hormonal shifts or physiological shifts that occur around the timing of breeding, and males often will fight each other for access to females for mating opportunities. And so we will see aggression between the males on these pupping sites. In general, outside of the mating season, in my experience, they tend to be curious, but not aggressive. So really the aggressiveness we see is mostly related to the pupping and breeding season. Likewise, a mom with a pup would be aggressive if she feels like someone is a threat to her pup. What else do we have? What is the difference between seals and sea lions? So another great question. So they all belong to that group that I mentioned, the pinnipeds, which also includes walruses. So true seals are like the gray seals and harbor seals and harp seals and hooded seals, and there's a couple of things. They do not have ears, so they have ear holes. They can hear, but they don't have outer ear flaps. They move a little bit differently. They propel themselves. Their foreflippers are short, and they sort of move along like little beach slugs. sea lions and fur seals, which are part of the group called the odoriids. They have outer ear flaps, and they also have much larger foreflippers, and they can rotate them and actually get up on all fours and walk. So when you think of circus seals, those are most often not seals. They're actually usually sea lions or fur seals. They're the odoriids. True seals can't sort of get up and balance things on their nose and all those tricks that we sometimes have seen historically in circuses and some shows. The other thing is their distribution. So true seals tend to be more towards the poles. So whether they're things like gray seals and harbor seals and harp seals, or the Antarctic seals, whereas the odoriids or the fur seals and sea lions, we tend to see them sort of in the temperate to tropical areas. So we see them along the west coast of California all the way down into the Sea of Cortez and parts of Mexico. And so they have a different geographic distribution. And the last thing is also their life history strategy. So we've talked about that there's a fairly fast weaning period for seals, and that's true. Gray seals, we said it's about 16 to 21 days. Hooded seals, which have their pups up on ice floes, it's actually 4 days. Hooded seals are born, and 4 days later they're weaned. What we see in the odoriids, or those fur seals and sea lions, is that those pups will be with their moms anywhere from 6 months to a year. So there's a lot of similarities, of course, amongst those groups, but also a lot of differences. Here's a next great question. Is there an age when females stop mating? So that's a great question. And as far as we know, no. We do see females with pups well into their 30s, but that is an interesting question because really, in most of nature, there's very few species that actually have post-reproductive females. We see that in humans. We see it in orcas, we see it in pilot whales, but it's really quite rare. But that's a great question about the seals. Let's see what else we have here. See if I missed any other questions. One question is, once these pups leave for the sea, what will most likely be their hunting range? So that's another great question. Again, from some of the tagging that's been done, we put 2 tags actually on weaned pups up in Maine. They were caught not on Seal Island, but on Green Island, which is not too far away, closer to Bar Harbor. And what we saw was within a few weeks, they were moving all around out towards just south of Nova Scotia. One of them came down to Cape Cod, and researchers on Sable Island at the DFO, Department of Fisheries and Oceans, they've deployed many, many satellite tags, and they have seen animals leave Sable Island and move all around from Nova Scotia down into the Cape Cod area. And so their foraging range is probably quite broad. Obviously, the pups are probably not traveling quite as far, quite as quick as an adult might be. But there's a lot of movement, which goes back to the foraging question. If you're wondering what they're eating, that piece of where they're eating is really important as well, especially if you're trying to ascertain things like competition with fisheries or ecosystem impacts. Let's see what other questions we have. Do seals contract the flu? Oh, this is where I need my health people. Yes, they do. And so there are groups, especially over at Tufts University, who are out surveying the wild populations to look for various diseases in these populations, to keep track of various diseases that are found in the wild populations and their potential to move. So yes, there are various diseases which can be found in the wild populations, including influenza. They're usually variants of what we get. What other questions? Let's see, what else do we have here? So there's a question about, let's see, trying to find new questions that I haven't answered yet. There are some questions about contaminants. I am not a contaminant expert at all, but we do know that there are contaminants, although things like DDT has been limited. There are contaminants out in the environment, and there are researchers looking at those levels, and we know that some of those chemicals can have an adverse impact, and maybe sublethal. We know, or we think that some contaminants are probably impacting seals at a level where maybe they're just becoming a little bit more immunocompromised, so they aren't able to fight off infections as well and things like that. So there is ongoing work looking at contaminants in the environment and how those are impacting wild populations. We also know that some of those chemicals can be endocrine disruptors and can impact things like fertility as well. Looking at just a few more questions here. So I think that we have reached almost the end of our time period. I will hang out for another couple of minutes in case there are any last questions that I haven't been able to answer yet. Please send them now. I am happy to answer them. So, trying to think of anything else that I wasn't able to cover yet. Again, I did mention this at the beginning, but I think it's really important when thinking about the populations that we're seeing here is to keep them in mind the context that they are part of this much larger Northwest Atlantic population. And so what we're seeing here is just part of a much bigger story of this population that's ranging from Nantucket Sound, again, all the way north into the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And I always like to have people keep that perspective, and also that really their story is really a story of recovery, which from a conservation standpoint is really exciting. Oh good, one more question about mating. Great. Do seals have more than one mate? Do they mate for life? So seals do not mate for life. And yes, they do have more than one mate, even in a season. So the males in some areas actively try to control territories to restrict access to females so they can father the most pups. And we know that females probably mate with more than one male as well. Genetic studies have shown us that for the most part, studies in the UK, the males that are on the breeding beaches do end up fathering most of the pups that are born the next year, but there's always a percentage where the paternity can't be assigned because the males that fathered those pups weren't on the beach, they weren't sampled, and so probably there's some mating going on in the water as well. And so they do have more than one mate, and they definitely do not mate for life. I'm trying to see if there are any other questions that I did not answer. I think that is most of the questions that we have in here. I will hang out for one more minute just to see if anything else comes in. I just want to thank you all for joining me today, and thanks to explore.org for this great camera system that allows us all to have a window into this pretty amazing time period in the seals' lives and be able to watch remotely and learn more. I'm going to just check for any last questions. Thank you all for joining me today, and thanks so much. I hope you enjoy the last few days with the gray seal pups on Seal Island. Bye-bye.